Hello everyone, welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course Introduction to World Literature, where we take a look at some of the important aspects of this short story, The Third and Final Continent by Jhumpa Lahiri. And as you know, this is part of a Pulitzer winning short story collection, and this work can be situated within the larger body of writing now known as diasporic studies. I would like to take you through the history and background of the term diaspora and how I would like to situate this term in our discussions today. The term diaspora was first confined to the study of Jews and their experience in exile, but from the 1960s and 70s we find the term undergoing a lot of change and the term getting used in different other contexts. And this, the base for the framework that I am providing now in terms of the chronology and the historical background is from Robert Cohen's 2008 work Global Diaspora, a Routledge publication. And in the 1960s and 70s, when this idea of the diaspora get extended, it also involves the experience of the Africans, the Armenians and the Irish. So it gets a larger context, a larger connection to talk about. And from the 1980s onwards, we find that the diaspora extends itself. It becomes an inclusive category to include different categories of people such as expatriates, expellees, political refugees, alien residents, immigrants, ethnic and racial minorities. So it becomes a handy term to talk about many things in the context of the post-coloniality as well. And as an offshoot of this in the 1990s, we find this emerging as a particularly complex concept. If you're familiar with the post-colonial writings of the contemporary, we know that diaspora studies and diaspora writing is a significant part, a significant component of post-colonial writings and post-colonial experiences. So in the 1990s, the complexity involved with diasporic studies, the concept of diaspora, the changing ways in which the paradigms of diasporic studies get defined, it also begins to be seen as a delimiting category where identities are deterritorialized, constructed and deconstructed. And in the contemporary, when we talk about diaspora or the studies related to diaspora, or when we are talking about a diasporic community which is represented in any work of writing, we are also talking about the consolidation of many ideologies. We are talking about three major things under which most of the experiences of the diaspora could be included. One, the dispersion from the homeland. Two, homeland orientation and boundary maintenance. So at the end of a discussion of this short story, it's also important for us to think about where we would like to situate the diasporic experience that is being manifested and narrated in Lahiri's short story, The Third and Final Continent. In a diasporic world, what we are introduced to is the in-betweenness of the worlds. It is about how the immigrants select, shift and modify to adapt to a certain environment that they choose to live in, they choose to emigrate to. So there is a kind of negotiation which happens, which is flexible and fluid at the same time. And in this short story, The Last and Final Continent, we do realize that this flexibility and fluidity, it makes the narrative very simple, but it also exposes the complexity, the complex concepts which are underlying the idea of the diaspora, and also defining and redefining the aspects of diasporic studies. To quote Cohen, immigrants do not simply shed their old or native values for new ones. So this is something that we notice throughout in this short story and in some of the other short stories from the same collection. And we realize that the narrator, the nameless narrator in this short story, The Third and Final Continent, whether it's a narrator or the people associated with him, particularly we come across his wife as another important character who's undergoing this process. We find that they do not shed their older native values for new ones, but on the contrary, we find things getting changed when it comes to the second generation immigrants. The story has been talked about in a number of ways. It has been seen as one of the exemplary works which in a very simple rhetoric has represented and has narrated the diasporic, the experiences of an immigrant. But what strikes me as very significant is the gendered experiences but what strikes me as extremely significant is the diasporic experience also becoming a gendered experience. We are introduced to the narrator in the beginning, and halfway through the story, you know that the wife Mala, also joins him in America. So then for the narrator, it's not the first diasporic experience, it's his second one, the first one being in London. And in the second one, he is a married man working in Boston in America. And for the woman, for Mala, who joins the narrator, who continues to be nameless, for Mala, who joins the narrator in Boston, it's a doubly painful experience because she has to deal with the claims of old and new patriarchies. And if you remember earlier in the story, when he talks about the first 5 days that they spent together in Calcutta soon after the wedding and before he flies to Boston, we find the story telling us that Mala was weeping at night thinking about her parents, and we do not find the narrator reaching out to her or making an effort to console her. On the contrary, he is trying to deal with the diasporic experience that awaits him. He is going through a guidebook which will perhaps help him fit better in this new place in America, in Boston. And also at a later point, when Mala meets Mrs. Croft for the first time, we find her evaluating her, literally sizing her up. Mala is there in a sari, and that is an attire that's there is a certain way in which the story also tells us that the narrator almost regrets for having offered to take her out, because he didn't want her to go out, appear with him in such an outlandish attire. But in any case, when Mrs. Croft evaluates her and says that she is nice and then says that she likes her, we find the narrator becoming happy, and we find that a new kind of bonding also begins to develop between the husband and wife at that time, when she is found to be good in someone else's eyes, especially in Mrs. Croft's eyes. We do find Mala going through a rather delicate situation, though the story does not tell us that directly, and Mala does not seem to mind that either, but nevertheless she is someone who has to perhaps continually change herself and continually stay aware of the claims of the old and new patriarchies. And Mala nevertheless attempts to retain her identity in multiple ways, because the only identity that she possesses, the only identity through which she made this migration, where she transformed herself into an immigrant, was because of this identity that she possesses as the narrator's wife. So she attempts to retain her identity, her personal identity, in multiple ways, which is by either wearing a sari or by using the right kind of accessories, coconut oil, the cooking curry, and the way she disowns oxtail soup in the flight, and then how she brings over Darjeeling tea every time she goes back to Calcutta, and then the pajamas. And we get to know that there's a certain way in which he tries to retain the identity and its authentic roots in multiple ways. And this is the way she gets described: a woman in sari with a dot painted on her forehead and bracelets staked on her wrists. So this is the typical ideal Indian woman that Mala is, and we do not find this story deliberately trying to question that at all. Of course, that's an interesting narrative strategy to show us how ingrained these things are in both the narrator and Mala, irrespective of this new experience, this new experience in a different country. And we also find this dichotomy working out perfectly well, where the man continues to remain as a breadwinner, the educated, the career-oriented, the ambitious one, who fits in a particular way into this new fabric of the nation, to new fabric of the new country that they have moved to. But the woman, Mala, continues to be domesticated. She proves herself as very adept in handling domestic affairs. Yeah, if you recall this instance in the halfway through the story, when they start living together in Boston, she goes out to buy a potato peeler, a tablecloth, fresh garlic and ginger, and we also get to know that she's good at knitting and cooking. And even after having spent 30 odd years in Boston, we find the narrator telling us that she still cries occasionally at night, but thinking about her son this time, who's away studying in Harvard. So this also tells us about how her subjectivity remains pretty much bounded to the domestic affairs, and there's hardly a different identity that she finds for herself throughout this process of 3 decades. When the narrator is talking about the ways in which he found himself, maybe just in very limited ways, in this new city to which he has migrated, we find Mala pretty much remaining the same self, with a few things changing about her. She has stopped covering her head, the narrator tells us, and a few things about the way she carries herself has changed. Otherwise, she remains essentially this woman who remains at home taking care of the domestic affairs. And this is essentially, this also becomes essentially different for second generation immigrant women. Lahiri's own story, The Blessed House, which is part of the same collection, tells us about that experience as well. The story also introduces us to 2 widows. Mrs. Croft, who emerges as this strong American woman with strong traditional values, but she also had managed to raise her daughter almost single-handedly, and she continues to take care of her when we meet her first in the story, even though she is about more than 100 years old. And on the other hand, we find the narrator thinking about his own mother, who was widowed when he was just about 16 years old, and we find the narrator telling us that the mother almost went insane. There was no way she could have handled it, and she didn't handle it well at all. So we find the narrator making this inadvertent comparison between Mrs. Croft, who manages to lead a strong life in America, and the narrator's mother, who literally crumbles down and continues to lead a miserable life after her husband's death. And this is also important in situating the diasporic experience, the way they begin to see, the way the narrator begins to see the different ways in which different experiences are being responded to in these 2 countries. The one country that he has left behind, the culture that he has left behind, and the other one that he is now part of but not able to entirely embrace either. When you take a closer look at the story, you get to know that the story begins in the 1960s, particularly 1964. 1964 is the year when the narrator leaves for London from Calcutta. He spends his student years there, and then he gets a job in Boston in America. He comes back to Calcutta, gets married to Mala, and then leaves for Boston again. And then we get to know that Mala also joins him in another few months' time. So I want to draw your attention to the time period where this is set. 1964 is also an eventful time in India and America. In India, we find that the Indo-China War is happening, to which the short story does not make a mention at all. And more importantly, the narrator who is leaving from Calcutta does not choose to tell us about the politics, the Calcutta riot, which is happening back home. The intention is not to draw attention to the things that the story does not talk about, but I want you to think about the ways in which there is a selection of events which is happening here. The moon landing, of course, it is part of the story in a way in which he begins this conversation with Mrs. Croft, but the story chooses to tell us about this iconic event in human history. In Neil Armstrong's words, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And the story continues to talk about the event of moon landing. It becomes an important image. And when the story ends, we find the narrator comparing himself to the astronauts and even feeling much, much better about himself and the way he has journeyed through these 3 continents. And the fact that the story chooses to talk about the event of moon landing, which is sans politics, which does not really call for any personal investment from the narrator's side to think about politics in any strong terms. And he finds it convenient to omit perhaps events such as the Indo-China War or the Calcutta riots or even the Vietnam War, which happens in America and goes on till 1975. We know that it started after 1955 and it went on for years. And when the narrator is spending his time in America, America is going through a turbulent time. The world is also being criticized for its policies and as part of the Vietnam War, but the story chooses to stay away from all of these things. Rather, we have a narrator who chooses to stay away from all of these things. So what does that tell us about the narrator? And this is something, the details that he chooses to omit, I find it is extremely useful in understanding the subject position that this narrator chooses to inhabit. And we get to know a lot of things about the narrator. We do not know his name. We know about the kind of steps that he made at different points of time to make it big in his career. We know that he left Calcutta, he left India as a very young man, and he then managed to live a life, a full life, a successful life, a contented life in Boston, in America. So what is it about the narrator's subject position that affords him to remain politically aloof, indifferent, and safe? We are being introduced to a very smooth immigration experience here. We find that the narrator feels very proud of himself that he left his homeland and he travels through 2 new continents which were alien to him. But what is hard to miss is also the fact that when he first arrived in London, there was a certain familiar setting already waiting for him, so to speak. We find him talking about the other Bengali bachelors with whom he shared food, a similar space, and there are a lot of shared things which are already there available for him. He just has to go and inhabit that by choosing the subject position. And we are also given to understand that the narrator, while he continues nameless, he's an upper caste Hindu, male, middle class, educated, rational, modern self. How do we get to know about the castedness of the self? It is through the dietary choices that at least his wife makes. And about his rational self, we also get to know that though he chooses to marry this woman, he also wants to portray himself as a modern man, and he also chooses to pursue modern occupation. He wants to enjoy all the benefits of the modern world. And towards the end, we find him briefly talking about his son, and they think that he may stop having rice and stop talking in Bengali after they are gone. And there is a way in which he is willing to let that go as well. And that is that part of this self, the one that aspires to be modern but continues traditional enough so that they don't have oxtail soup in the flight. So for this self, which this narrator embodies, religion and caste are not important at all. On the other hand, they can easily adapt to the modern situations whenever there is a need to. The situation of this narrator, the subject position that he embodies, is very important in understanding the diasporic world of this short story within the framework of the post-colonial experience as well. So in the following session, where we try to take a closer look at the story, where we try to read the story together by paying attention to the particular details and the techniques through which the narrator is being presented to us, we hope to have more discussions in related terms. So I hope you will be more familiar with the story by the time we read it together in the next session. I encourage you to access the story and do the reading by yourself before we start discussing this as part of the session. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.